This is Dr. Michael Karasis.
Hello, you all.
And so our presentation tonight is going to be basically walking through his work, which is an American Civil War Memorial. That's the formal title of this piece. I'm going to sit down and run the PowerPoint, and then we will have some moments where we'll have some conversation to allow Dr. Karasis to actually reflect on his work and share some insight. And we'll go through movement by movement of the work. And we also are going to be able to play audio clips. So in some cases, the clips will be playing as we're kind of talking above them, and then there's some other times when we can drop in some things if we want to have some specifics, all right? We certainly don't want to keep us here all night. With the two of us, we said, well, if we get going, we probably end up sitting here talking 4 hours. We don't want to do that to you all. But if you do have maybe a point in time where you have a question that you'd like to ask, we certainly are a small enough group that we can invite the idea of offering up and presenting a question to get answered, all right? So we're going to sit down, so we have more of like a conversational, Walter Cronkite kind of you were there kind of situation, or actually Mike Wallace, I think, was the one that did that, right? So great. This beautiful, beautiful poster was kind of designed, and we found this piece of artwork, and it's actually now hanging in my house in the poster, and it's kind of been a nice reminder of me as I've been kind of walking through this, and so we have a great board that does all the work to kind of make all of this happen. So our first slide, obviously, is just kind of reviewing what it is that we are talking about. I'm going to talk about some of the milestones in the war, and then as we go, each movement will lift up and discuss it. Because it involves a orchestra and a chorus, it is by musical definition an oratorio. And then, of course, we will open up and have questions here with the composer as he's with us. So let us begin. The first movement of the piece is called the overture, and the overture. I have to be honest now with Michael. As I started listening to the piece, I was struggling a little bit about getting my head wrapped around exactly how to approach the movement, because unlike the others, he didn't have any specific title as to what it was that it was discussing, and the tone of the piece varies quite greatly, meaning that there's some moments of contemplation, and then there's moments of certainly tension, and then there's some moments of actual eruption of event. And it's kind of difficult because I don't think this piece is a piece of program music, but in essence, I have evolved my understanding of it to make it a piece of program music. And so in this first overture, I imagine this to be the years coming up to the actual eruption of hostilities at Fort Sumter. And so there are a number of major events that kind of set this. And so as we're going to begin in a moment to listen to a little bit of this, I want you to think about these various events that took place prior to that attack at Fort Sumter as being some of the things that are going on while it is that the overture is playing. So the first thing is that the Supreme Court handed down a decision on the Dred Scott case. Now, the Dred Scott case was lifting up an individual who was African American and what it was that his particular rights were to be a free man. And the decision in March of 1857 did two things. The first thing it did is it struck down the Missouri Compromise. Quickly, the Missouri Compromise was set in 1820 essentially to alleviate tensions between the North and the South at that point by equally allowing states to enter the Union, one as a free state and one as a slave state. And this kept the peace for essentially about 25 years. But this decision struck that down, saying that Congress could not dictate to a state whether they wanted to be a free state or a slave state. All right, that was something that needed to be decided by the territories as they were applying for statehood. So it eliminated this compromise. The second piece is that in the case of somebody like the individual Dred Scott, it also stated that persons of African descent were never intended to be allowed to have citizenship under the U.S. Constitution. Now we hear this now and see this as a Supreme Court decision, and we're almost dropping our jaws to say, how is it that this decision, this kind of decision, got passed? Legally, most legal historians and experts say that this is probably the quote-unquote worst decision in the history of the Supreme Court, as it is actually eliminating individual rights as opposed to supporting them under the Constitution. But as a result, it was essentially stripping away anybody, not just the people that were actually slaves, but anybody in the United States that was, in essence, black, having history as being African, from being able to take citizenship in the United States. It was, of course, since overturned after the passing of the Emancipation Proclamation, but this obviously caused a lot of tension, both in the North and in the South. A second major event that was happening during these days was the individual John Brown, who was an abolitionist. He spent a number of years carving out a plan in which he was going to have a slave revolt emerge in order for them to essentially take and liberate to their own freedom. And he had a plan to do this throughout the nation, but he wanted to set the catalyst in one specific spot. And the place that he wanted to do that happened to be Harper's Ferry, Virginia. The irony is that Harper's Ferry will also now play a role as a major battle place for the Civil War in mere months after this takes place. And so, as he was attempting to uprise the slaves to come out of their bondage, there was no galvanizing both of the slaves themselves or any support thereafter. And so his efforts failed. He was arrested, ironically, by then Colonel Robert E. Lee, and ultimately was jailed, was tried, was convicted, and formally executed for treason. You might have learned in grade school the song John Brown's Body is Lying in His Grave. This is the John Brown that song is making reference to, and was created after his death by abolitionists who were crushed by what happened to this individual. The other more recent historical note about this is that there is only a few times in the history of America, the United States, that we can define insurrection. It's a very unique term because it means that there is actually an organized attempt to overthrow the government. And honestly, it hasn't happened that many times. One example of an insurrection indeed was the event with John Brown, because what he was doing at that point was to have an uprising against the existing society and government in order to allow these people to be free. A second example of insurrection is the Civil War itself, because the states ultimately seceded from the Union and created their own constitution and their own union. And third, one that is more familiar to us, is the events that happened at the Capitol on January 6th, a mere few years ago. And so that term is reserved for only particular instances in American history. The 1860 Democratic Convention was quite fascinating. For us now that are living through what happened during the election period now just last year, and remember the cycles that we've had there, and then some of us who are older that we also recall some of the more turbulent cycles, say in the year 2000, the year 1968. It is nothing in comparison to what happened during the election of 1860. First of all, the Democratic Party met in Charleston, South Carolina on April 23rd of 1860. Stephen A. Douglas was the leading candidate going into the convention. If you're like, I think I know that name, yes you do. That is the same Stephen A. Douglas that actually debated with Abraham Lincoln in the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates all across the state of Illinois for the Senate seat in 1856. President Buchanan was the president at the time and had decided not to run again because of his lack of efficiency of running the nation. He couldn't because the nation quite literally was breaking apart. But he was still a Democrat, and he was working against Douglas's nomination because he kind of felt that some of the things that Douglas stood for, including taking a harder stance against slavery, was not in the benefit of the party. So after a week of bickering at the convention in Charleston, they could not decide on a platform. And we're talking about slavery, because there were northern states that wanted to have steps to abolish it, and there were southern states that were buried in making sure that we weren't going to touch slavery. So delegates from mostly southern states, in this case, of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, and Texas, all walked out of the Democratic Convention, to the degree where they could not arrive at a decision for either a platform or a candidate. What they did agree upon was to reconvene in June, on the 18th, in Baltimore instead. And some of the delegates who walked out of Charleston, though, were not welcome to be reseated at the reconvening of the convention in 1860. This created a greater fissure. And in support of those not welcome delegates, additional delegations from Virginia, North Carolina, California, and Oregon also walked out. Now, if you all remember the 1968 convention, there was similar things that happened with certain delegates from certain states walking out based on certain decisions that were being made at the convention. None of that was anywhere near what happened here in 1860. All right, I'm going to actually begin the music here so that we're going to start to see, and as already these events I've painted for you, see how this music starts to paint this tension that exists before the war begins. Whoops, let me make sure I got it playing. Is it playing? There we go. I don't want it to be overwhelming, but I do want you to be able to hear it. Are you actually hearing something?
No, we aren't.
No,
No, all right.
really faint.
Yes.
Yeah,
Really?
well, we have to be careful because there is, of course, a large dynamic difference, but I want you to have a little bit understanding of some of it. So as we have here, we have kind of percussion and brass kind of setting the tone of an underlying tension, all right? And that's kind of where it is that we're thinking about with stuff.
So
So-
sorry.
So as we continue, in July 6th of 1854 in Jackson, Michigan, the Republican Party, the same party that the GOP is today, was formed, and it was grounded in a party based against slavery. Abraham Lincoln, who ran for the U.S. Senate in 1856 but lost to Stephen A. Douglas, was a rising star in the new Republican Party, and in 1860 was considered to be a presidential favorite. He was on the ticket. However, he was not the favorite to win the nomination. Instead, William H. Seward was the one that actually was, going into the convention, the favored individual. The convention was indeed here in Chicago. You might recognize that name because Seward ultimately did serve in Lincoln's cabinet. Lincoln upset Seward at the Republican convention in Chicago in the summer of 1860, and the Republicans also passed at that time an anti-slavery platform for their candidates to run on. With the Democrats in disarray at this point, Lincoln was nominated prior to them actually organizing and nominating their candidate. Lincoln's path to the White House was overwhelming, and he won 180 of the electoral votes. So you can see the music here continues to actually grow in this tension. Now I've got the clip here still, so we'll just jump ahead a little bit and give you some more flavor. So following Lincoln's election, the South Carolina, in November, the South Carolina legislature had a secession convention in December of 1860. And on December 17th at 1:30 p.m., the Carolina legislature adopted an ordinance of secession from the Constitution of the United States. Because that is essentially how it is that you were granted statehood, is that you sign on an agreement with the governing documents for the United States of America by adopting the Constitution as being your rule of law. They, at that moment, rejected the Constitution, and that is how it is that they created a situation where they were no longer a state in the United States of America. Once that was done, January 9th of 1861, so you can see there was a number of weeks, but states followed. Mississippi on January 9th, Florida on January 10th, Alabama on January 11th, Georgia on January 19th, Louisiana on January 26th, and Texas on February 1st. Now, this is not all the states, because some of the states that ultimately joined the Confederacy actually didn't leave until after the attack on Fort Sumter. Alabama, though, after these states left the Union, called for a secession convention on February 4th. In essence, that was to figure out a way to come together and create a new country, okay? And so, in that intervening period between February 4th and February 8th, they created a new constitution, very highly based on the existing U.S. Constitution, took a vote, and then ultimately had their own presidential convention and nominated and voted for Jefferson Davis as president and inaugurated him on February 18th of 1861. So all of those things taking place in a handful of weeks in February of 1861. So we're not there. Ultimately, we're going to see what happens next, and I will show you a little bit more further what we're doing with the music here. So as much as we're getting this tension, this is still musically setting up this idea before we even having all this stuff. This is merely, in my mind, the separation from the country, the voting, all these kinds of things. So finally, we have a situation where the war ultimately begins. So Lincoln is inaugurated on March 4th of 1861 in Washington. This happens to be after Jefferson Davis is inaugurated. In his inaugural address, Lincoln states unequivocally that he would hold, occupy, and possess all property belonging to the federal government, even those in Confederate territory. And this is where this moment in the music is representing this. This is Lincoln's firmness of what it is that he's doing. He's holding a stance, okay? He's defining what's going to be and that, okay? So that leads into this next movement, so hang on a second. Jefferson Davis meant every word he said about seceding from the Union. Fort Sumter was a federally held stronghold in Charleston Harbor. The sight of the American flag flying there was an affront to South Carolinians. And when Lincoln, when told to capitulate and evacuate the fort, Jefferson Davis ordered General P.G.T. Beauregard to bombard the fort. And after 36 hours, on April 14th, a rebel flag flew over Fort Sumter. This is the definition of the beginning of the Civil War. So now that we've actually gone through this entire first movement, and I kind of shared also all the thoughts in and around that, let's hear from you about your concept about the overture. What was it that you were essentially expressing, and what made you make the choices for some of the musical themes and moments that you put into that first movement, that overture?
In general, my idea about an overture before a piece this big is to introduce the ideas that you're going to hear later on in more expanded form. You get a taste of this, you get a taste of that, and they blend together. So the overture is giving hints of what's coming. Just like, Scott said, historically, that's what's going on. Musically, in my mind, it was, we have to decide what's the important point in the next 9 movements that's coming up. Give a taste of it to see how they blend together and how it makes a musical picture to begin into the second movement. That's how I felt about it.
So did you take any particular instruments to represent any kinds of particular items? I mean, sometimes as we kind of experience certain things, when you're creating some tension in your music, you have a tendency to use lower strings and the lower winds, for example, bassoon and a clarinet and things like that. And brighter moments, obviously, sometimes, but then there's also themes, that you're actually using that adds a particular trumpet. Was there any kind of thinking of any military inspiration or whatever, choosing the instruments that you had some of these themes used?
Very definitely. Over the course of the oratorio, you'll hear the trumpets, usually in unison, 2 or 3 playing at the same time. Dun 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 dun. It's sort of like a call to arms. Get ready, something bad is going to happen. So you hear that on and off throughout the whole oratorio in the background, especially in the overture, where they sound very clearly, and they have to be very, very powerful in the emotional content that they're describing. So to answer that question, that does say something very specific.
So it's really interesting because for those of you, most of you know, Dr. Karasis has also created a visual series of slides to be presented during the piece. So I'm just giving little touches of visualization here. But as you start to collect all this information in your mind, I think it will actually start to play when you start to understand and enjoy some of the other significant pieces in the performance. All right, we move to the second movement. The second movement, in essence, is, in my mind, Dr. Karasis is lifting up of the plight of the African-American slave. As much as this work is about the event that the Civil War is, in many cases, I think that we're talking about the small pieces, the people, the individual impacts that it had on families, and the real lives, as opposed to the grandiose military plans that you see in a lot of the textbooks that we read, where this general did this way, and these people moved that way, and they encountered this here. In all of that stuff was the experience of the individuals that were going through this. One of the things that I just kind of discovered in studying these things at this point in time is how skirmishes would suddenly just emerge out of just two opposing forces coming out of a forest. Each of them doing very much the same thing, scouring around trying to find supplies and food. And they quite literally would bust in on a family farm, take all the food that they had, and leave them with very little, all right? And both forces did this. This is not regulated to either the northern forces or the southern forces. And in many cases, they were occupying the same time. But when these forces would suddenly just come upon each other, looking for the same stuff on the same farm, there oftentimes were skirmishes that are not ever put in the history books. And there was death and anything taking place, not to mention the destruction of the family farm in the process of the fighting. And this is what was going on all these months throughout the conflict. So this is kind of reflecting back on the plantation life that the African-American slave had to endure. This movement is interesting as the chorus sings in it. The chorus, in my thought, is a third-person interpreter of this experience. And in the text that they share, there is essentially starts describing what their life is like and the use of song in their lives. That's the reason why I thought you're actually having us sing in this movement. Then the next piece, of course, is expressing what it is they have to do. And in this case, using song in their work on a daily basis. And then finally, there's the longing, the song that they use in order to ask the Lord for guidance and for help, and to evoke hope in their existence. And in those cases, it's in the guise of the use of children. Many times they figured that their own lives had no possible chance of getting better, but they were praying and hoping and keeping the hope alive for their kids. And so as we listen to the pieces of this movement, this is where I think we see the chorus reporting this as we go. Plantation life in the antebellum South was characterized by strict social hierarchy, and in an agricultural economy heavily dependent on the forced labor of enslaved African Americans. This explains why the South actually defended this practice so much. It was the way they lived. Plantation owners, planters, the apex of this society were the wealthy planters, a small elite who owned the land, held political influence, and often possessed vast numbers of enslaved people, what we would define today as the 1%, okay? Overseers and slave drivers on larger plantations, white overseers, often considered lower class. They were white, but they were probably still uneducated, were hired to manage the enslaved workforce, enforce discipline, and ensure production goals that were met. This is what created this idea of whites being superior to blacks, because in many cases they were the overseers, the discipline, the ones that were keeping, quote unquote, the labor force in line. So maybe somewhat of a foreman type role, but in many cases much more violent, and certainly with the bigotedness of that relationship. Enslaved people at the bottom of this hierarchy were enslaved men, women, and children. treated as property with no legal rights under the law, and subjugated to forced labor, violence, and harsh living conditions. Their lives revolved around working the fields or performing domestic tasks from sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week. Let me begin playing the movement now for you. Enslaved families, despite the brutal realities of slavery, enslaved people formed families and communities, maintaining connections even when separated by sale or hiring out. Agricultural focus, the Southern economy was heavily agrarian, relying on large-scale cultivation of cash crops like cotton, tobacco, rice, and indigo. The planter system, fueled by slave labor, generated significant wealth for the South and was a key contributor to the broader American economy. The chorus in this movement gives a third-person account to the conditions African-American slaves needed to endure. Now, in the case of all slaves, we can read stories in which smaller, especially smaller households that were wealthy enough to own slaves as property, in many cases sometimes became members of the family. And so there's even, in this context, at plantation situations, family members that would have slaves that were serving them in their homes grow to the place where they became a little bit more than just owned property, okay? But this was not the condition for most slaves. And so that's why the abomination of maintaining this practice ultimately is one that, from a moral point of view, there was a large growing sense of needing to end. So this entire movement has a sense of melancholy to it. What is it that you were absolutely looking to achieve in the musical choices you made in expressing what you did with the text? Because the text tells us really what you were going after in the message you wanted us to receive. But where was it that you were making some of those choices musical?
Well, musically, I'm trying to express, imagine a scenario where the slaves are in the hot, humid, miserable fields picking cotton with their children. Everybody's sweating, miserable as can be. And up on the hill is this calm, beautiful, Greek, beautiful mansion. And the children of the massa are playing with their toys. And they're singing. And the slaves down below say, someday my children will sing like that. That's the feeling I have with this movement.
So it's very specific. And I'll wait until the next chorus entrance to show you how it is that it evolves from this moment of reflection to this moment of actually the labor in the fields.
It's constructed musically as a waltz, nice, flowing, and easy. Their longing is expressed in a waltz. That's what you're hearing.
So in my mind, the concept here, though, is still prior to the beginning of the hostilities of the war. Here it comes. And one of the choices that he starts to make from a musical standpoint again is the use of tools in the percussion. 2 steel spikes that would have been used in actually building the railroads, he uses in order to clank together to create one of the sounds. He actually has the rattling of steel chains in order to actually make some of those ideas of the labor being done, which I think is very effective.
Work quickly and stuff. So they mark their days, by 1 day or 2, something.
And so the narrator is really important in sharing some of the thoughts in addition to the text that's being sung by the choir. All right, so we'll move on to the third movement, part 3, First Encounters. So I'll start this right away, and then we'll get into some of the music here. April 15th, Lincoln issued a proclamation to the states to supply 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The North responded enthusiastically. War fever swept the South as well, with calls for an invasion of Washington to remove the Republican government. Virginia seceded on April 17th. We all know why that's significant, because Virginia, quite frankly, was right across the river from Washington. Washington was under siege. Within weeks, the largest army in the history of the Republic was assembled. Two things that was amazing: the size of the army and how fast it was actually assembled. General Robert E. Lee took command of Confederate forces and created a defensive posture, something that actually was maintained by the South throughout the war, maybe to their detriment. The first official battle of Bull Run took place on July 21st, 1861. Bull Run, it was just a mere 26 miles from Washington, D.C., in Virginia, and Manassas and the town of Harper's Ferry were nearby. Union civilians had come out in carriages to watch the Union victory and were surprised with seeing the Confederates win the day. The victory at Bull Run had Southerners believing they had won the war, and in many cases, they went home. Why? Because there was work to do at home. Northerners realized that the war would not end quickly as a result of this, and Congress raised an additional army of 500,000. This is why people said that the Confederacy was doomed from the start, because their resources were limited from the beginning of the war. The fact that Lee was savvy enough to actually make it last as long as he did was really the reason why we defend the Confederate leadership as being superior to that of the Northern leadership in the execution of the war, until later points in that. You got to go to talk to somebody else about those kind of details, though. So we're going to play a little bit of this because I'm going to drop it in the middle. Let's see here. Because you can hear right away the militaristic elements of the movement right away as it starts.
In my opinion, the Civil War was fought by the North with one arm tied behind its back. It was still one. It had so many resources over the South.
So as we let this music kind of settle in a little bit, this kind of reflects this idea that I shared. Both sides were enthusiastic about engaging into what was going to take place. In the South, they were defending their homeland. So they were defending their way of life and their homeland. But the North saw the Southerners as being hypocrites to the very promise of what America, the United States, was. And so the fact that they had the audacity to pull out of the political process and establish their own was what was problematic. And like he said, from the very start, they knew they had the superior forces. And so the intentions and thoughts in the North was the war was going to be over very quickly. Months. The original conscription for Union soldiers was 3 months. You signed them up, and they barely actually got this first battle in before some of the conscription was going to run out. They needed to quickly get these soldiers re-upped by the time that this battle concluded to make sure that they didn't lose their army in just the weeks following that Battle of Bull Run. And the Confederates, ultimately, they were like, their purpose was the same. And they were actually heartened by the fact that they pushed the Union back at that first Battle of Bull Run. It was one of the few battles where they actually were victorious, but it heartened them enough to get the Confederacy to be behind the possibility of being able to overrun the Union and get to Washington, which they felt would put the North into a situation of signing a treaty to end the war. And so this is all this stuff that's going on here. But then on top of that, whoops, I didn't want to go back. It doesn't want me to do that. Not nice. All right, well, sorry, that's all we're going to hear. So later on, the intentions of the battles get more fierce. So I think that we're going through and we're hearing a number of the early battles in the first couple of years of the war taking place in that movement. Now, like I said, his intention was to take a piece and really show what the aspect of effect was on all people involved. Now we're really getting to the heart and the crux of that individual soldier and their families that are back at home. In this movement called Letters from Home. Being a soldier in the Union or Confederate Army had a number of first experiences for those involved in the conflict. Volumes have been written on the battles, but the amount of writing about the downtime between battles has been recorded in the letters written to and from soldiers and their families. A great portion of the soldiers' experience,
Waiting and how long before
boredom.
They wrote of battles and fear. The women wore the frowns of worry day by day until the next letter should come, saying to carry their memories deep in the heart and to carry them low.
So letters and newspapers from home were very welcome to the soldiers on the battlefields. Only second to a direct visit from someone from your hometown. With our modern communication, we text somebody. Letters was the best thing that they had outside of being with them. Letters from soldiers back home brought relief to the families at home. It meant news from their loved ones and confidence that they were well, that they were still alive. For some families, though, the letters stopped. And this movement reflects also on those emotions. As this movement evolves, we'll start to hear how it is not just the talk back and forth between our two characters here, but ultimately what happens when the letters do stop. So I'm going to continue, and we'll play a little bit more of the clip here. Again, it's not doing what I want it to do, which I have been frustrated about all the time. There we are. So, these are some excerpts from a couple of real letters written during the war, expressing just kind of getting into it. This is from Camp Scott on April 28, 1861. Dear Mother, I received your letter on the Thursday evening and was glad to hear from you. We were sworn in on Thursday and are drilling now 4 times a day. Our uniforms are here. They are distributing the shirts now. I don't know the number of our company yet, but I will let you know it as soon as I can. I received the blankets and buttercup, the butter, and they came very nice. Our butter was just about done. Lieutenant Culp read a chapter in the Bible and sang, Peter sends his love to all. He received your letter last night. Give my love to all. Nothing more at present. Your affectionate son, Johnston Skelly. From Rolla, Missouri, September 21st, 1861. Dear wife and children, we amuse ourselves in thousands different ways after supper. Then the regular business of the evening comes. Reading, writing. These are not my typos. This is how the letter was actually written. Written letters, jumping, some to the running races. Some get tighter in squads, card playing, some singing. Uncle Sam, he is the best man I ever worked for. Private Thomas Teal, 14 Infantry, Scott County, Illinois. Camp Defiance, May 24th, 1861. We were sworn in for 3 months and we can go home when the time expires if we wish. But I think most of the men will not stop until the war is over. And if we can't whip them son of bitches in 3 months, then we will not stop until we can. Private Thomas Barnett, 9th Infantry, Madison County, Wisconsin. Continuing on with these letters, and or at least I'm intending to. Nope.
Little thing that might interest you is the two characters in this Letters from Home, they're named Mila Joe and Billy. I got those names from people I knew when I was at Milligan as a student. I used to roller skate with a gal named Mila Joe. And her boyfriend, much bigger than me, I like Mila Joe, I like her a lot. But her boyfriend was 3 times my size. So I never, other than once in a while I'd skate with her. But his name was Sonny. And I thought about this, I said, what are 2 names that might work? Mila Joe sounded perfect. And then instead of Sonny, I used the word Billy.
I've never heard that name, Mila Joe.
Mila Joe.
All right, I had it all set up and then it disappeared on me, so I thought we were good. Anyway, I'll finish this up and then we'll move on. When the realities of war hit, many soldiers needed to share their experiences with those at home. Williamsburg, Virginia, May 8th, 1862. Doubtless you are very uneasy about me. I hope this reaches you, that you have heard of my safety. We stood in the field until our ammunition was about exhausted. Every time we fired our guns, they sank in the mud. About 3 o'clock p.m., the enemy flanked us on the left and made a desperate charge. The battery was retaken that night and the rebels driven from their fortifications. So they were experiencing exactly what it was that they were doing that night. Any other thoughts about these? This particular, you set it up just beautifully now, what you said.
If I can say there's a tearjerker in this oratorio, it would be this movement, Letters from Home.
All of this kind of really resonates with me, but I have to say that this particular movement really resonates with me the most. The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, was a pivotal 3-day battle in the American Civil War taking place in and around the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It is known as the bloodiest battle of the war, with significant casualties on both sides, and is widely considered a turning point in the conflict. The Union victory halted Confederate General Robert E. Lee's second attempt to invade the North. Pickett's charge was a failed Confederate infantry assault during the Battle of Gettysburg on July 3, 1863. It involved a frontal attack by approximately 12,500 Confederate soldiers, primarily from General George Pickett's division, against the Union Center on Cemetery Ridge. The charge, intended to break the Union line, resulted in devastating casualties for the Confederacy and is considered a turning point in the Civil War. This movement explores the horrific battle of those 3 days, culminating in the most violent portion of the movement in its final moments, Pickett's charge. I'm not going to play the entire movement for you, but as I analyzed this and prepared it now, I saw you actually, now whether your intent was to do this or not, I don't know. But for me, I saw you outlining each day of the Battle of Gettysburg with the surprise engagement that took place on the first day, that overnight suddenly stay as a result of the Confederacy not going and finishing the job. The second day that looked as though it was significant, Little Round Top took place on the 2nd of July. And so it was amazing that the Confederacy failed. However, the mistake they made the night before, with the Union allowed to keep the high ground, is portrayed to me in the music. And then again, the overnight and the conclusion of that battle. And then finally, the most vicious of the 3 days being the last day. And what you did, because you upped the ante musically. It's like, to me, that's what you were doing. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what you were doing, but that is how it is that it ultimately played out for me.
Yeah, you're very close, I must say. The 3 days are probably the most significant battle, 3 days in the entire war. Some people say it was a turning point. Some people say there was so much more war to go. I think the mistake that was made after the Battle of Gettysburg is the North did not pursue the retreating South. They let them go. Big mistake. I think the war could have ended much sooner had they pursued a weakened enemy. They didn't. They all rested. They gave the South time to regroup and gain strength.
So let's take a little listen to what he does, and I'll see if I can skip ahead a little bit.
By the way, there are no photographs of active battle during the Civil War, not one.
Yeah, but plenty of pictures of the dead soldiers in those
Many
battlefields.
pictures before and after the battle, but never during active combat.
Do you know what that is?
Why it is?
Yeah.
Probably too damn dangerous.
Well, I don't think it was dangerous. I think the photography technology at the time required everything to take, I mean, you needed to add, the exposures were gonna take, yeah. Right, yeah, you needed minutes. So, yeah, so the idea that things were so chaotic and moving so much, you just would've gotten a bunch of blur. There really wasn't gonna be an
When you
ability
see
yet to
When you
capture
see
it.
Civil War photographs of people, they have stands behind them holding their head still so they don't move at all.
Yeah,
A blink of the eye, it would alert.
yeah.
Stewart was one that did most of those, post-battle ones that I remember,
Mhm.
right? Stewart.
I think one of the reasons the North did not pursue is the horror of what just happened. I think they were in
I can understand.
battle shock. I think because it was so intense, I think it wasn't a normal thing that anyone could mentally grasp. There's so many casualties.
Oh, yeah, they were decimated as well, yeah. They had superior forces, but they were just almost as decimated as the Confederate troops were.
Can you possibly imagine the horror in any war, not just Civil War, World War II, World War I, war is war. To being on a battlefield and your life an inch from ending at any moment. How can that feel? It's hard for us to imagine such a thing.
Yeah, and the formations in which they were
They were so
at the
tight.
time was the military's latest technology in actually how to engage into warfare, based on how far, the cannons could reach, what the artillery could do.
Yeah,
They discovered that was the easiest and the best way. If they were actually more spread out, they would actually have more damage done as a result of shrapnel and other things. So having everybody tight in like they did and maintaining the lines was the most effective way to overcome the opposing lines, is to march in that formation.
Very good
Kind of
point.
crazy to us as we look at it, but what it was actually created in Europe right before the Civil War came to pass, yeah.
and the tactics that the generals and the people under the generals decided to use on these various encounters, it's amazing. President Eisenhower, General Eisenhower in World War II carried a book around in his back pocket. You know what that book was? Caesar's Gallic Wars. He studied Julius Caesar, how he attacked the people. In the Civil War, there were similar readings of Caesar and the tactics he used for Rome to expand. There was a Bible to them. Amazing stuff.
So this is where you can absolutely feel the engagements, the growth of the engagements, and then as it kind of settles down, and then as it returns again later in the movement. You all will really enjoy listening to this as it unfolds for you, and the performance on Saturday.
Week from Saturday.
Yeah.
Wait for
yeah.
Do not come to the church this Saturday.
Don't come this Saturday,
I
right,
won't be
yeah.
there.
At this point in time in the piece, we're going to actually break, and this is one of the things we're talking about prior to our beginning, is the presentation of colors and the folding of a flag in memorial of those that actually lost their lives during the Civil War. And then following that presentation, this movement, the Soldiers' Lament. So over 50,000 Americans died in the 3-day battle at Gettysburg. It is still the largest loss of American life in any one battle over the course of the 3 days in American history, including any war since. Many notifications were given to families about the loss of a loved one. For others, they learned of their soldier's death by the mere stoppage of their letters coming. Many of the Civil War dead were laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. That was property that was formerly owned by General Robert E. Lee. And he spent his retirement in his home in Arlington looking over the Civil War dead, a constant reminder of what he was a party to. This movement is written as a remembrance of the loss and the pain their families shared and the shocking images of young men dying in the battlefields, their eyes wide open. So this is some pretty heavy stuff.
It should be. There's a quote I can tell you, a paraphrase from the chorus. Frozen eyes that stare to the sky, never knowing the reason why. This man only knows what to compose, but this man will never go home.
Is the Burns piece talked about people putting in, my name is John Smith and I died, but this is not Gettysburg, that is later, correct? Where people were not expecting to live.
I don't really know the answer to that, but
Yeah, it got to be later, yeah.
Okay.
Because some of the more severe battles, actually, as we get closer to the end of the war,
Yeah.
they were, because Grant was now not retreating anymore. And the savagery of what took place was even greater than what we experienced at Gettysburg. They happened more frequently with smaller troops, but that's when people started knowing when they were going into the battle that they would start putting who they were so they could be found.
more
Yeah.
people were killed and maimed in the Civil War than Americans killed in World War I and World War II combined. It was a bloodbath. I think the main reason for oratorios like this is so we don't forget. We always remember.
But do you think it was the most Americans that ever died, you know, because it was Americans fighting Americans?
Yes, that's
Mostly?
one of the
But,
ways,
you
yes.
know, I mean, it's still incredibly impactful, right?
Right, yeah, I mean, that is true. The reason the numbers are the way they are is because it was. We consider both sides as Americans.
Yeah.
And so the casualties on both sides are counted together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good point, good point.
Not that it's not, you know, incredibly important, but
Right.
Yep.
just thinking about that too.
So this has got a sweet melancholy. So even though the essence of this particular movement is indeed sad, it nowhere nears the tragedy that the next movement does. So as we hear this, those instruments, now that we're hearing the oboe here, there's a sweetness to the melancholy. But as we get into this next movement, we know that that sweetness isn't there. However, you still found a way to figure out how to create, I'm going to have you elaborate on this in a moment, how to create the end of this, that there's victory in this particular moment. I'm not saying I quote unquote have an argument with you, but I struggle a little bit given the subject matter of this particular movement, and it's Andersonville. Andersonville Prison, known also as Camp Sumter, was a notorious Confederate prisoner of war camp during the final 14 months of the American Civil War. Located in Georgia, was the largest and deadliest of the Confederacy's prisons, infamous for its horrific conditions and high mortality rate. Over these 14 months, nearly 45,000 Union soldiers were imprisoned there. And the photos that you see here actually outline the amount of space that the prison actually contained. So you have to imagine having 45,000 people stuffed in to that arena. And in that case, it's like a racetrack size kind of thing, all right? And there were approximately 13,000 of those 45 that died within its walls. The location of this was southwest Macon County, Georgia. It was pretty far south in Georgia, near the town of Andersonville, hence its name. Designed for 10,000 prisoners, it quickly became overcrowded, housing over 30,000 at its peak. Causes of death, you would think it had to do with the war, but it didn't.
Disease.
It was disease, typhoid fever, dysentery, and other illnesses spread rapidly due to unsanitary conditions. Malnutrition, due to food shortages and inadequate rations that led to starvation and weakened prisoners. Exposure, the open-air stockade offered little protection from the elements, leading to death from exposure. And finally, overcrowding. the large number of prisoners crammed into a small space exacerbated all of these other prior issues. Conditions in this prison camp rivaled those that were found in Nazi death camps found at the end of World War II. Even in the conditions of the camps in Europe, some of the things that were done there were purposely being done with organization. What was happening was similarly to what happened here at Andersonville. However, the Confederacy was broke. And some of the conditions that actually existed here was because they had no other resources. And they simply, people were starving because they had no food to give them, because their own soldiers didn't have shoes. And so it's a terrible thing, but it's perverted and just as terrible as experiences that took place in Europe. In this movement, our composer uses the word the devil's playground to inspire the music of despair he uses. However, as many soldiers were, the end of the movement is filled with hope as the prisoners are set free and informed that the war is over. This is what I'm talking about. You somehow, in some way, found hope in the despair that was taking place in this. Because you're right.
It's called the devil's.
There indeed were soldiers that discovered the war was over by being in this prison.
Yeah, that's true. Being in such horror is beyond our imagination, let alone being freed from it. That's even beyond our imagination, being freed from such horror. So I don't know, I asked myself many times during this composition, which way to go to describe an emotion. Music is nothing to me but emotion, pure emotion, most greatest of the arts. And to find hope at the end of something so horrible is in a way beyond words. It's something that you can only deal with your heart. So this prisoner is freed from solitary.
Prisoners were forced to march in endless
After this torture. And a little quip at the end you might hear in the performances. When he leaves his solitary confinement, he notices that there was a flower that grew in the crack on the floor in the light of the sun that survived the darkness. Big hope.
What about some of the choices of instruments here? We were hearing a little bit this theme of the bassoon. Boom, 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 boom. This, given that the title, you were absolutely attempting to portray the conditions of this place.
Yes.
So how is it that the instrument choices that you made communicate those particular ideas?
Well, it seemed to me, at least at the time, other composers might have completely different ideas, but to me it seemed to me that brass were very important in this kind of thing, because the chorus is mimicking the brass, and a lot of times there's dissonance in what they're singing. It's not and the rhythm and the tempi are different. For example, 3/4 time is nice and easy. It's a waltz. 4/4 it's a march, but 5/4 it's off center. It's kilter. It leaves you uncomfortable, and so that's what I had in mind throughout this section, anyway, dealing with such a subject.
Don't in vain. Some light in the blackness of solitude. Surely there was a God who knew of these things, who could make it all go away. Where was he? Could not even he visit such a place?
I want to see if I can actually get to the very end so that we hear at least a little portion of the... I still have not figured out how to get that icon up here, which is a little maddening for me.
Do you want some help?
Well, I mean, it's like, all I want is that audio icon to pop up so that I can actually move the clip through.
There was a story I read once about Andersonville. There was a creek that ran through Andersonville, and
See, it's playing.
from one end to the other.
I'm
And it
wanting
was
just
used
that.
as a bathroom, it was used as drinking water, as a place to wash whatever clothes they had to wash, all in the same water. Typhoid fever.
There's-
Nothing was refrigerated then.
It was was called the Devil's.
So if there was meat, it had to be dried.
Yeah, it's crazy. It's like, I don't understand why sometimes I can pull it up and sometimes I can't.
Have you traveled to some of these
Yeah.
places
There.
over the course of
I
your
I was in Gettysburg years ago with my wife, and
Yeah, it's weird, isn't it?
stood on Little Round Top and Cemetery Ridge.
So-
So here, we found it, and here's a little bit of what happens at the end. Very little of
A
it.
ray of misty light streamed
Oh,
down
that's-
beside him as he spoke, shone upon a flower that had grown and survived the darkness.
It was a positive chord.
You know, did you ever see the movie, All Quiet on the Western Front?
Mhm.
The old one, not the new one, the old one.
The old one.
And at the end, he sees a flower, he's gonna pick it, and he gets shot.
Okay, apparently, I'm failing, so y'all have to listen to it on a week from Saturday. All right, part 7. This is really interesting. This movement, to me, is all centered around the idea, why the hell do we do this? Why is it that what do we take from this whole experience to realize that these deaths didn't happen for nothing? So what I've done here is, I've kind of talked about the cost, and then I'm gonna let you kind of let the movement speak to what it is, and you, of course, personally can share some thoughts. But here's some numbers to let you know. The cost in money for the United States, the Union debt skyrocketed from their annual budget deficit from $64 million in 1860 to $2.6 billion by the end of the war. I'm talking in 1860.
Dollars.
Yes, yeah. All right.
Wow.
That's what, in part, created the greenbacks. The reason our money became green was because that ink was cheap. And they were created in order to create wealth and to finance the war. So in 1862, the Legal Tender Act authorized the printing of paper money, not backed by gold or silver, to stimulate the northern economy and finance the war. More successful in the north than the south, because obviously, as you can see here in the photo, the Confederates printed their own money too. The Union sold over $500 million in bonds, and a large portion of the war was financed through the sale of war bonds, according to the American Battlefield Trust. The government also increased taxes, including the first income tax in U.S. history. For the Confederacy raised funds through taxation, but this was less effective due to their smaller economic base. They also sold bonds, but Confederate bonds were less successful due to the Confederacy's limited access to capital markets. And paper monies, the Confederacy relied heavily on printing paper money, which led to severe inflation and ultimately near worthlessness of their Confederacy. Their currency, excuse me. There is this little scene in the movie Showboat at the beginning of the film where some hill folks that were coming down in order to see the show on the boat pay for their tickets with the money that they had, which was Confederate coin. And so when they actually got there and paid, they were like, hey, you can't use this as a Confederate. Why not? It's the money that we use up in the hills, is what the guy says. And of course, the big burly guy, and they're like, oh, okay, you're gonna go in then. But it's just to speak, some people wouldn't have even known the difference. The human costs of the Civil War. Estimates vary, but commonly cited figures to 620,000 soldiers killed in action or from wounds. Disease was a major killer during the war, claiming more lives than combat in some instances. A large number of soldiers were wounded and disabled, suffering lifelong physical and mental health consequences. And one of the more well-known and significant of those lifelong mental health consequences was nothing less than General U.S. Grant. While not as well documented, civilians also suffered significant losses due to the war's impact on their lives and communities. We talked about that skirmish on a farm. The 620,000 deaths represented roughly 2% of the population in the 1860s, of the U.S. population. In addition to the direct loss of life, the war also had profound impacts on emotional and psychological trauma, The war left a lasting legacy of emotional and psychological trauma for individuals, families, and communities. Social and economic disruption, some of which we hinted to, the war's disruption to the social fabric of the nation, leading to the widespread poverty, homelessness, and social unrest, particularly in the South. And then, of course, obviously, the war exacerbated racial tensions, contributing to the ongoing struggle for civil rights. So you have to imagine that all of this, 2% of the US population, currently where we are, imagine what 2% of our population would be in the way of deaths. It would be large, it would be more than some of our largest cities. Kind of an amazing figure to think about. So what is your thinking and your approach to this particular movement? How is it that we went this way when you're talking about now composing the last couple of movements of this work?
It's a hard question to answer. They shall not have died in vain. What was it all about? I wonder if they really knew what it was all about when they were fighting. Can we oversimplify and just say it was slavery? I think there was more than that. It's a lot more than that. It's not oversimplified to say the war was to free the slaves. Sure it was, but there was a lot more. So this other stuff that's involved in this whole thing gives a feeling of, we hope this wasn't for nothing. These 20-year-old guys having their arms blown off by cannon fire, was it for nothing? So that's what I was trying to find. It was a difficult movement to write because I was struggling trying to put this together. But I have the chorus doing a lot in this movement because you want to hear the human voice here. Was it in vain? That comes better from a voice, in my opinion, than an instrument, actually. So that's why we hear the chorus.
I think that's interesting because the struggle that you were just talking about the actual composition of this piece is really played out in how it is that the writing is. You often actually have the voices interacting on top of each other in different places. This doesn't happen really with the chorus appearances prior in the work. But here, suddenly it's like voice here and a voice here and a voice here, kind of piling on top of you. That cacophony of thought and differential and confusion very much plays out now how it is that you wrote it. So that kind of really shows where it was that you were conflicted in some of the ideas that you were trying to express.
Sure.
Yeah. And yet again, the same instruments that we talked about expressing the melancholy in the plantation movement and in the Soldier's Lament are again playing here again. The oboes and the bassoons and the clarinets, all creating a staid melancholy feel as we're reflecting on what takes place.
I agree totally with what you're saying.
The other thing that strikes me about this particular movement is we didn't have a lot of time to celebrate it. Okay, we're going to get into this a little bit now as we discuss the next movement. But as the war was being over, then all of a sudden, Lincoln is shot. And some of the hope for what the future was very much wrapped up in his leadership post-Civil War. Gets destroyed within a week of when it is that hostilities were defined as being finished.
Biggest irony of the war. Probably Simon, the narrator says, and there was a long train that rode back to Springfield.
Asking again the same question.
If the Civil War had never been fought, it's my opinion, tell me what you think, Scott, that eventually slavery would have disappeared. It would have been inevitable. Was it all in vain?
Well, it's certainly been a long time because we're still struggling with racial tension today. And so some of the events that happened over the course of the war certainly pushed forward things that we are still struggling with doing. And we know even that some of the civil rights voting acts and the elimination of Jim Crow laws also took more than 100 years. So as much as we took steps forward in the succeeding years following the war, we took steps back. You know, so it may be true, but I would still say we'd be struggling with the concept of it even today, and maybe well into the 20th century. I'm not sure it would have been a foregone thought.
I think there was so much tension during that time leading up to the events of the Civil War that it was kind of like a bubble just waiting to burst. And I think it was sort of inevitable for it to happen. Like, not that they died in vain, but I think that so much was happening and everybody was just like getting to when the only way they knew how to handle it was to fight versus just.
Yeah, and that's why, quite frankly, solutions to problems are usually resulted in that kind of thing, in that kind of conflict, yeah. Because the price, up until a moment like this, was not as high. Maybe, you know, soldiers would die, but this started to actually show by having civilian casualties and to have a wider swath of destruction and the amount that actually impacted both sides as a result of the war starts to change the concept of how war is being used as a solution to those kind of political problems. All right, so finally we're at a place where the cessation of the hostilities has taken place. So a long battle took place outside the town of Appomattox. And for those of you that know about the Civil War, this might be a piece of it that you don't understand or recall as well. This meeting took place because the two armies were quite literally beating the crap out of each other outside of this courthouse, within miles of this place. And Lee was getting to the place where he was losing so many people, so much, so often, because Grant was just unrelenting, chasing after him. So they would retreat and not get the reprieve that was happening in the first 2.5 years of fighting. And he got to the place, Lee got to the place of saying, I can't put these kids through this anymore because the inevitability of loss is in front of me. So that historic meeting at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia is where the American Civil War effectively ended on April 9th, 1865. General Robert E. Lee, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant and the Union Army. This surrender took place in the McLean House in the village of Appomattox Courthouse. Lee walked in saying, I have come to discuss the terms of surrender. He wrote a note to Lee saying, I wish to have a meeting with you to discuss the terms of surrender. And Grant graciously acknowledged, allowing Lee to maintain his sword and firearm at the meeting. Grant's generous terms at Appomattox set a precedent for other surrenders and facilitated a path toward national reconciliation. The terms allowed Confederate soldiers to return home after laying down their arms, and officers could keep their sidearms and personal belongings. While some smaller Confederate forces continued to fight for a time, and the official end of the war was not formally declared until August of 1866. Appomattox Courthouse is recognized as the major turning point that effectively sealed the fate of the Confederacy and ushered in the end of the bloody 4-year conflict. In this movement, you will hear church bells. The reason this is significant is because not only here, but even in Europe, church bells began to ring. Celebrations that the war was over started across the nation. Church bells were recognition of major events in the lives of municipalities, good and bad. If you were being attacked, the bells would ring. If the war was over, the church bells would ring. And America adopted that practice. These celebrations, however, were short-lived. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, 1865, dying the morning after at 7:22 a.m. We'll give a little listen to the beginning of Appomattox. So, this theme, to me, is the most memorable of the entire work. Its use in here is quite wonderful. But as we begin, this is, to me, the fatigue that Lee is feeling in battle that ultimately spurs him to say, I need to come to the table and put an end to this. And so, once this is set, we now have the chorus come in and echo the same tune with the words.
And Lee's feeling, putting an end to this with dignity. With dignity.
The other thing you also do in this movement, which I want you to elaborate on why you made this choice, is you quote well-known American tunes. You quote right here, Dixie. And then you also quote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I can't be lost on thinking that the Battle Hymn is to represent the Union and Dixie is to represent the South. And so that makes sense to me, but what made you decide to incorporate well-known tunes that you still hadn't done to this point in the piece?
It was an idea that occurred to me. I didn't write this in succession, one movement after the other. I did various things and put them together at the end. So to answer that question, it just felt best for me to bring something familiar to everyone's ear. At about this point in the oratorio, it's when it's 80% finished. So, a soprano or a mezzo soprano sings Battle Hymn of the Republic part.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As a soprano, yeah.
And she
This
sings-
is also the first use of the solo quartet. So the chorus does indeed make an entrance here, but ultimately these ideas, the musical ideas at this point, are done by the solo quartet.
There she goes.
Mm-hmm. Now the other thing that happens in here, which we'll see if we can let it flow into this, is the choice of what you do to actually finish what happens. And that's of course the spoken chorus portions.
Yeah.
Tell us how that idea came about.
The idea came about when I was visiting the battlefields. I only visited a few of them. I was so mesmerized by everything. It would take months to visit everything. But indeed, I said to myself, let's look at the map and see where these major and somewhat minor, or none minor, battlefields took place. There was endless numbers of these farmers' fields and savannas here and there. So instead of singing the various locations of battle, I had them sprechstimmen, say it without song. So they'll say Gettysburg, Savannah, Bull Run, Fredericksburg, and you'll hear that perhaps in this section. Notifying us all of the fact that this was occurring in many, many different places at one time.
I really would love to be able to play that one for you, so let me see if I can figure out how to do that. There we
The
go.
beginning theme, for some reason I've got Beethoven, the second movement, or Beethoven seventh.
Yeah.
Is that where I'm feeling that or getting that?
Perhaps so.
I mean, I hadn't brought up the fact that there's a couple of times where I feel as though you're emulating Beethoven.
Yeah.
That being one, this one being one, and then of course the other one actually coming in the final movement, which I may actually make mention of. Any particular way that you felt inspired by Beethoven?
Oh,
I mean, who isn't inspired by Beethoven, right?
The hero of my life. I
I
think.
lost it. It's kind of too bad.
Not only of his genius, but of his courage.
His suffering.
Incomparable man. And he suffered so much. Physically, everybody knows about the deafness, but he had many other illnesses.
Other hand.
Many. He suffered. And he created the,
There it is. Now let's see. All right, so
Depression.
hopefully we're going to be able to hear these.
oh yeah.
Here we go.
This piece was written in Victorian dress. we wanted to have the audience hear music that might have been familiar to a sergeant at Gettysburg or a private at Fredericksburg. Something that wouldn't be too modern for him to know. So this kind of stuff was going on in Victorian Europe. This kind of music, this powerful, romantic stuff. So that's why we wrote it like that. It's a piece in Victorian dress.
It was a long, long train that rode painfully back to Springfield, for it wore with it
Senator Simon the last few years of his life. He was a wonderful man. Wonderful man. I wish he could have become president, but Kennedy beat him. But I was at his house once. He asked me to come when we were talking about him narrating this. And I went down to Carbondale where he lived. And we had dinner. And I'll give you one guess what he served for dinner. You probably won't get it, but you'll laugh when you hear it. Bow tie pasta.
That's what he said.
Oh, wow. He was one of my grandfather's best friends.
Oh, what a wonderful man.
He served.
I like him too.
Yeah. He was an honest politician, can you believe that?
Right, what an oxymoron.
Yeah.
All right, well, you will enjoy hearing that list of all of the battlefields in the context. We've got some nice thoughts, and I want to finish this up here. So we're in that last movement of the piece, part 9. Dr. Karasis mentions how he uses some of the themes that are introduced in the overture. For me, that's most significantly recognizable in this movement. Now that the piece is coming to a conclusion, we kind of have now returned to what was the beginning. And so musically we hear that. The other thing that I was going to touch on that you and I haven't spoken of, I can't say that you were quote unquote inspired, because in both of these cases, one of these things you would have had been able to hear before you wrote, but the other wasn't written until after you completed this piece. And that is the sounds of this particular movement echo that of other scores that bring forth the sense of memorial over battle. And the scores that I'm thinking of particularly is Richard Rodgers' Victory at Sea, and then John Williams' score for Saving Private Ryan. And when you listen to this particular anthem, because in the cases I'm speaking of, it's reflection from after the completion of the battles, and the reflection of what has taken place, and an equal dose of majesticness, celebration, and hope for the future, which in these cases, all of these things did. Williams, when he's writing Saving Private Ryan, was very much including the thoughts that Spielberg had of making this an ode to the greatest generation. That's what he was doing when he made that film. And Rodgers wanted to make the idea of the nautical feel, but also the importance that the Navy played in actually overcoming the Japanese in the Pacific, and the significance that all of that had, and the sacrifices that had to be made in order to accomplish it. I find there's a lot of elements here that are very reminiscent of what both those composers were doing in both of those cases. The theme of the regiment, which we also hear in a couple of prior movements, makes its way into this again. I find that also fascinating from the place that after all the thing that we've done to discuss things on big concept, you still go back to that individual man marching, whether it had been in those lines from place to place or in the lines of battle on the battlefield. That individual marching, that you brought forth with the theme is still the significant piece of what you've lifted up in the work. And I find it's personified by that. And then finally, you take us to church. You utilize the church bells to announce the victory, but then you also very much struck a very hymn-like structure in the chorus of celebration, which is exactly what would have been happening at the end of the war, right? That people would have gone and offering thanks to God for being victorious, at least in the North, that is, and for the war finally being over and being gracious for all that. And the melody that you structure and the harmonics that you structure is very much hymn-like in that moment. So I find that the message for this is not just for the people of the day. It is just as much for us. That all of these themes that you're speaking of and all of the emotions that we go through of overcoming adversity is really what's at the core of this. And this is the only movement of the piece where we're not truly embedded exclusively in the time. Yeah. You've brought it now here at the end to be important to us. Am I anywhere close to where it is that you were kind of wanting to go with it?
Very much, yeah.
Yeah.
That was an intent I had, yeah. Anthem to Brotherhood could mean many things, but it's universal. Doesn't matter what time it was, human history, it all means the same. So it concludes mentally as well, like that, I hoped.
So I'm gonna try to just play a clip of this for a little bit, so that I'm gonna wrap up. But here is this kind of mixture of victory, and this is very much where I say the Richard Rodgers film score very much comes to mind to me. My dad loved this score, so he used to play it. It took me a long time to appreciate that, but as I got to know Rodgers' music then, I could really understand the differences that he brought to actually the Karasis compared to all the rest of his writing. And of course, it was all designed to go with Navy films of the battles on the Pacific. And then some of the quieter moments that you do are the ones that I think are reflective of what Williams did in Saving Private Ryan. See, right there is a very real Williams-esque kind of writing right there. Now, whether he's emulating that or not, I don't know if he even knows, right? Sometimes you're just affected by what it is that is in your life, right?
I never saw Saving Private Ryan. I never saw the movie.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and it would have been written, like I said, after, the movie came out after you wrote this. But that use of horns, again, is also something very Williams-esque. So I want to make sure that I give you the last say. Obviously, the music will make sure you have the last say when we enjoy the performance. So I want to finish by saying, so the American Civil War, initially deepening divisions, ultimately served as a catalyst for national unity, and the war resolved the issue of secession and slavery. And the subsequent period of Reconstruction, though flawed, pushed the nation toward a more unified and integrated future. However, the legacy of the war, including racial inequality and economic disparities, continued to shape American society for generations to come. And this is a rendition of the American flag as it was at the conclusion of the war, adopted in 1866, with the 36 states, having Nevada been the most recent to enter the Union at this point. And it could have been very different. We could have had a continent that was further divided with a multitude of at least two nations, and maybe not even additional ones that would have come, with more skirmishes if the Confederacy would have wanted expansion out west. We don't know what things would have looked like. So for me, I want to say that the travel through this, and when we first discussed this, you and I, about what we were going to do, my affinity for being, this history, doing much the same thing of taking, and my conductor's notes in the program will reflect how I spent the family vacations going and visiting Civil War battlefields and doing that stuff, and having been at Gettysburg myself. The interest in this work, of course, but the depths of which I actually began to understand things about the war I wouldn't have had without the exploration of the piece. And so it's been a personal journey for me that I think has been absolutely fantastic. So I thank you for that opportunity. So share with us whatever final thoughts that you might want to, or whatever about things. I have no idea.
Something's on sale.
Yeah.
Blue light.
30 minutes.
Okay,
Oh,
we got
okay.
it out of here.
All right.
The subject of war has always fascinated me in a lot of ways. How masses of people can go to war and try to decimate each other at the orders of so few. I've always thought, even as a kid, what if the Army and the Navy decided they don't want to fight? Hell with these guys, get them out of there, assassinate them. That doesn't happen. They follow. Why? Why do they follow? The subject of war has always fascinated me. If you look in history, back as far as you want, except for maybe the 200 years after the reign of Caesar Augustus, where they had the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. For 200 years in the known world, there was no war, no battles. There better not have been. Rome would have crushed them. But there were no battles. Can you pick any other period in history that went 100 years without war somewhere in the world? Probably not. I just pockmarked different times. 1316, 1281, 708 BC, AD. 1821. Every one of those times, you can pick it all you want. Somewhere in the world there was going to be people killing each other. Man is set for this kind of activity for some reason. Why? Is a question I've never answered. And if anybody has the answer, I would deeply appreciate it. Yeah.
One thing of note is the United States had one civil war, and that was the only civil war that we've had. And that peace held the unity of the nation throughout all this time.
Good point.
Without bullets. Without bullets, but I would submit that we have engaged in other kinds of social war that has been going on for a bit.
Well, we could have a long conversation in and around that subject matter alone. I would argue that the agreement, the success of the United States Constitution and how it is that the people that actually formed those thoughts and put them together as a form of democracy and governing and republic is the reason why we haven't had more occasions of violent outbreak to the degree of the level of the Civil War. Because we have factions in which some of those disagreements have a place to get worked out, to actually take place. Because you're right, unrest is not unique to American history. There's plenty of other times, and obviously we're engaging in some of that right now. It's yet to be seen if we actually push to the brink, but I think that's what his point was originally. He writes a work like this to remind us of what the horrors of an experience like this really is, so that we find some better way to reconcile those differences than to get to the place where we're openly going to create hostility amongst ourselves. You know?
Aristotle said to his students in the Lyceum in ancient Greece, he walked with his students and he would say, at least that's what it's written, he would say, love is man's greatest revelation. War is man's most atrocious invention. Always remember that.
And I don't think that's sexist. I think you're right. I think man was the one responsible for
There
it.
you
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I think I'll put it there as being finished. I hope that you enjoyed it, and thank you.